Great day, folks. And again, I've just come back from an exhilarating run. And today I want to share with you a very interesting and very important topic. A very interesting method of running that has been very beneficial for many people I've coached and for myself. I'll tell you all the good things about it, and then I'll mention the one thing you might want to look out for, which isn't really a bad thing. But this method of running is very suitable for people of all ages and for all running goals. So basically, it's long distance interval training or long distance variable pace training. So if you don't mind the redundancy, I'd rather call it variable pace long distance interval training or long distance variable pace interval training. And why the redundancy? Because it stresses the very unique point about this, because most people think that if we run long distances, we have to run at steady pace. And otherwise it could be fartlek, but usually fartlek is not done in such long distances. And also in traditional fartlek and interval training, the Gershler type of intervals, we want to get into lactic acid conditions where we train lactic acid tolerance, oxygen debt tolerance. Now, this method is completely the opposite. And if I were to give credit where credit is due, and I really want to do so, this method was really invented by Ernst Van Aaken in the 1920s. And he used it very successfully with many of his runners. And the reason I don't call it Van Aaken method of training, even though that might probably be the correct way of terming this method of running, is that I have never been trained by a Van Aaken coach or someone who was coached by Van Aaken. And so I can't verify that everything that I'm telling you in this video is in alignment with Van Aaken's method. But what I can tell you is that the method I'm about to share with you, largely Van Aaken's ideas, do work. They have worked for me and for many of my clients and the runners that I've trained. And here goes. It's very simple. You have to bear in mind several very basic rules. And if at all times you observe these rules, there you have it. The Van Aaken variable pace long distance training method. And so it goes like this. Van Aaken believed we should not train to oxygen debt, because every time we train to oxygen debt, what would happen is we are taking out from the body as if you are withdrawing from a bank, in this case, energy. So imagine withdrawing energy from this bank in our body. Every time you go into oxygen debt, you draw from that bank, which means you're depleting the energy reserves. So Van Aaken believed that we should build up this bank account of energy reserves so that on race day, we have enough energy to not only last through the race, but to maximally perform in that race and be able to run as fast as we can. So the idea is that only in a race would we want to allow ourselves to get into oxygen debt, but that level before which we get into oxygen debt would hopefully be raised much higher through long distance aerobic training. Now, the difference between this and normal long distance aerobic training is that long distance aerobic training is usually done with steady pace running. And the problem with that, as we know, is that when we have a fixed steady pace of running, firstly, you get used to that pace and it becomes a kind of, you get into a hypnotic state where you are performing only at that pace and your body adapts to that pace, to running at that pace. I'm sorry if I'm a little distracted by the renovations that are going on outside, and I hope that the noise won't distract my viewers. But okay, let's get back to the story. So in traditional long distance type of training, what you do is you run a distance of 10, 20 kilometers per per session, and you run it at steady pace. Now, this is the build-up, of course, the aerobic base, before you actually add in interval training, which we'll talk about shortly. So the problem with doing long-distance aerobic training at a steady pace is that you get used to the pace, and your body adapts to that pace. The second issue about long-distance steady pace running is that you improve much more slowly. You improve much more slowly because the stimulus in terms of pace is very low. And then the third issue is that when you add in interval training, you now add in Gersler intervals, which gets you into oxygen debt, into a state of oxygen debt. And that, as I mentioned, was the opposite, the antithesis of Van Aaken's idea, because it, according to him, that withdraws energy from your bank. And that's not what you want to do. So the idea is you want to build up an aerobic base with long distance running, but at variable pace. Now, you ask me, isn't that the same as fartlek? What is the difference between this and fartlek and interval training? The difference is that in Van Aaken method of running, you don't get into oxygen debt. So here's the secret. At every distance of an interval that you run in the middle of a long distance run, and everything is incorporated into one run. That is not to say that during the week you can't do other types of speed work, although all types of speed work must obey the principle of oxygen debt avoidance. So what happens is that, let's take, for example, we go out for a 10-kilometer run. Most of the run is going to be done at 130 beats per minute of heart rate or less, never more than 130 beats. So that's the ceiling. However, it's not steady pace. So for example, we're going to inject 5 different paces into one run. Think about it. You get everything all in one. 5 different paces. So let's first inject marathon pace. So if at marathon pace, at your current level of fitness, you run at marathon pace, let's say close to goal pace, okay, 80% of goal pace. And you can maintain that, let's say, for 400 meters before you get into oxygen debt at your current state of fitness. So what would you do? You run it for 200 meters. It's very simple. You never get into oxygen debt, but you get a taste and you get training at that pace, in this case, marathon pace. Now, let's say now you do a second pace and you do a stride at 10 km race pace, okay? So your 10 km race pace, maybe now you're at 90% of 10 km race pace. But let's say you can't hold that for more than 300 meters. So how long are you going to do it? You're going to do it for 150 meters. It's that simple. It's that short. Okay, so the paces, at every pace that you run, you never reach a distance, you never run for a distance beyond which you will get into oxygen debt. Let's say now we run 5 km race pace, okay, or 90% of 5 km race pace. What you want to do, if you can run at 5 km race pace, 90% of 5 km race pace for 200 meters before you get into oxygen debt, you would run that stride no more than for 100 meters. And then let's say 800 meter race pace. Okay, 800 meter race pace. If you get into oxygen debt at 150 meters, then you will not run more than 70 or 80 meters for that stride. We'll get into the frequency of it, okay, during the run, because there are many components to this. And then the 5th pace that we're talking about is all-out sprint. Now, Van Aaken realized that oxygen debt begins, or lactic acid accumulation begins after about 60 meters of an all-out sprint. So if your 100-meter all-out sprint pace, you start developing oxygen debt at 60 meters, then run no more than 40, 50 meters. It's that simple. No more than 60 meters. And generally, my rule of thumb is 40 meters is enough. Yeah, 40 meters of an all-out sprint. 30 to 40 meters is more than enough. But you can play around with it. Maybe you reach about 45, 50 meters if you want of an all-out sprint. The whole idea is you never get into a state of oxygen debt, and you do not want to get into a state of fatigue, even muscular fatigue. Which brings up the next principle: run as long as you can, as relaxed as you can, with variable pace, but make sure you inject walking periods of rest, okay? Walking periods within this long distance run. So we mentioned 10 kilometers. So let's say you're going to jog slowly. After the initial warm-up, which I recommended 3 to 5 walks, right, as a warm-up, you start doing the 10 km workout. And what you're going to do is you're going to jog for 1 kilometer, all right? And then, you're going to jog for 2 kilometers. And then you're going to do, say, a stride at marathon race pace, okay? Marathon race pace. And you're going to do no more than 200 meters of that stride. And then you slow down into a jog and to a walk. Make sure you never get it into a state of oxygen debt, okay? And then from there, you after your walking break, you start jogging again. And then you're going to run slightly faster for the next 1 kilometer, and then jog again for 1 kilometer, and then you inject in, say, a 5 kilometer race pace run, stride, and you run it no more than 100 meters or so, 150 meters. And then you jog and you walk, take a walking break, and then you start jogging again, and you start running for the next 2 kilometers again. Beyond that, now you go for, say, 10 kilometer race pace. Okay, 10 kilometer race pace, maybe you run it this time for 180 meters, say, long before you get into oxygen debt. You just stride out at 180 meters at 10 km race pace, and then you come to a jog and then a walk again. You do this with a 20-to-1 ratio, according to Van Aaken. In other words, for every 20 kilometers of slow running, you're allowed to do 1 kilometer of faster running, okay? So my estimate so far, what has worked is every 2 kilometers, you stride. It's similar to the walk shuffle I recommended for the beginner. But in this case, you can use this particular method all the way up to elite level run training. So you can do it for the intermediate runner. You can do it for the advanced runner as well. Remember, never get into oxygen debt. Run as much as you can. And because you never get into oxygen debt and there's never any lactic acid accumulation, what's going to happen is that you're going to be able to prolong your runs. Your 10 kilometers can be 20 kilometers, you can be 30 kilometers. A single run can easily be a marathon, even 42 kilometers. Because you're walking, you're jogging, you're running, you're striding at 5 different paces. So imagine you now have Seb Coe's, Peter Coe's multi-paced run training all into one single long run, instead of having them spread out over interval training. You now have them interspersed within your long run, which can be as long as 30, 40 kilometers. But you just have to inject these paces in there and never run each segment so long that you get into oxygen debt. So one key pillar of this method is the avoidance of oxygen debt training. So what happens is, guess what? The other thing is Van Aaken wants you to run this as frequently as possible. So right now, most elite runners are running twice. Some Kenyans run 3 times per day, 6-7 days per week. But Van Aaken actually wrote such a program for the future student to train 5 times a day. Now you must be wondering, this is crazy. But that's because you've never tried training. You've probably never tried training below oxygen depth intensity. So if you're going to run fast for most of your run and your heart rate is beyond 130 beats per minute, then certainly running 5 times a day would be exhausting. But at 130 beats per minute of heart rate, the intensity is very low overall. But don't forget, now we have all 5 paces: marathon race pace, 10 km race pace, 5 km race pace, 800 meter race pace, and all out race pace. You have basically the entire 5 pace running formula, 5 pace training formula, all in one long run. And folks, we'll elaborate on this in future sessions, but if you're interested, leave me a comment below and I'll try to answer your questions. Meanwhile, try to do plenty of this. Plenty of walk, jogging, and every 2 kilometers you inject a stride at a specific pace that you want to train at. But it's best initially to get all 5 paces in so you have multi-pace training all in one. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next episode.